Hi, I'm Julia, and I'll be discussing the two visual pathways of the brain and how damage to these pathways can result in various neurological disorders, such as hemianopia and blind sight. I would like to start off with a quote from Chapter 4 of Ramachandran's book, Phantoms in the Brain. One could argue that the term consciousness doesn't mean anything unless you recognize the emotional significance and semantic associations of what you are looking at. And this is of particular importance to the what pathway of the visual system, which Ramachandran considers to be the new visual pathway. That brings me to my next point on the visual pathways in the brain. So we have the old pathway, which is the where pathway, which Ramachandran discusses as being important for orienting behavior. This begins in the retina, travels through the superior colliculus to the pulvinar and the thalamus, and then to the posterior parietal cortex. The new pathway, on the other hand, is more of the what and the how pathway. It's where a majority of the 30 visual areas are contained, and it's mainly responsible for recognizing objects and attaching emotional significance to things. This pathway begins in the retina, travels through the lateral geniculate nucleus, the primary visual cortex, and then splits off into two pathways, either the what or the how pathway. Now I'd like to discuss what happens when there is damage to these pathways, particularly in the primary visual cortex. As many of you probably know, when damage to the right primary cortex occurs, the person loses the ability to see their left visual field. And when damage is sustained to the left primary cortex, the person loses sight in their right visual field. And this condition of blindness is termed hemianopia. When Dr. Larry Weisskranz encountered a patient, DB, he found that this patient was completely blind to the left side of his world, even though he could see out of both eyes. The patient had had surgery to remove an abnormal clump of blood vessels from his right primary visual cortex, and this left him with damage in area V1. What Dr. Weisskranz found so fascinating about this patient was his ability to accurately point to markers in his left visual field, even though he claimed he could not see them. And you can see his accuracy in this graph. This showed that while DB's what pathway was not functioning because he was unable to name the object and rotation of the object he was looking at, his where pathway was still clearly and maybe unconsciously at work. Dr. Weisskranz named this strange phenomena blind sight and went on to diagnose others with it. Blind sight has been thoroughly studied and tested, but I was particularly interested in learning more about how damage to parts of the where pathway, or the old pathway, would affect this unconscious vision. I read a lot of different articles on hemianopia and blind sight, and found this study by Bertini and colleagues that was just done a few months ago. In this study, 12 subjects with damage to their right visual field, some with lesions in the pulvinar and some without, were tested in a series of fear response tasks in two separate conditions. In the first condition, face stimuli were presented only in the subject's blind areas, and in the second condition, the same face stimuli were presented concurrently in blind and intact visual fields. Here is a graph of response times for subjects viewing different faces: fearful faces, happy faces, and neutral faces. This graph compares response times of hemianopic subjects with pulvinar damage to those without damage, and you can probably see that the response times are much slower in those with damage to their pulvinar nuclei. So this study really shows us how important the pulvinar nuclei are in relaying fear-related visual stimuli from the superior colliculi to the amygdala. To relate this back to Ramachandran's book, he had talked about the old pathways' importance as an early warning system, and in this study we can really see that early warning system at work through the subconscious fear response of the pulvinar nuclei.